She mistook his silence for arrogance. He called it fear. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The storm rolled over New York like a restless heartbeat, rain tracing frantic lines across the glass walls of Hale Corporation. Inside the top-floor office, the air was colder than the weather outside. Adrian Hale, 35, the kind of man whose silence carried more weight than most people's words, stood by the window, his reflection a ghost against the skyline. The city lights flickered over his face, revealing eyes that looked calm but hid years of sleeplessness. On the table behind him lay a contract, thick, precise, and waiting for a signature. He had written every clause himself, every rule meant to protect him from the mess called feelings. Love was chaos. Love had cost him everything once. The elevator chimed softly, and she entered. Elena Brooks, a young architect whose entire world was crumbling under overdue bills and a cancelled project. Her coat was soaked, her shoulders stiff, but her eyes tired as they were still carried fire. Adrian turned, his voice slow and measured. Miss Brooks, thank you for coming on short notice. She nodded, unsure why the city's most private billionaire had summoned her personally. You said it was urgent. Adrian gestured to the chair across from his desk. It is. I have a proposal for you. Not a business one. Her brow furrowed. Then what kind? He met her eyes with a stillness that felt almost cruel. I need a wife. Temporarily. For a moment, the rain filled the silence between them. Elena blinked, convinced she had misheard. Excuse me? He slid the contract toward her, his expression unreadable. A marriage in name only. 6 months. You will attend events with me, live under my roof, and in return, you will receive $300,000 upon completion. Her jaw dropped. You are joking. I do not joke about contracts. He said it so plainly, so quietly, that it sounded like a sentence handed down in court. Elena stared at him, at the tailored suit, the impeccable posture, the emotionless tone. Everything about him screamed arrogance. Why me? She asked. Adrian's gaze flickered toward the rain. Because you are honest. And because you do not care who I am. Her laugh came out bitter. You must think very highly of yourself to assume I would marry you for money. No, he replied, eyes darkening just slightly. I think very little of myself to need to ask. That answer caught her off guard. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw something fragile in him, a shadow of fear. But it was gone in an instant, buried beneath that stoic calm. She exhaled sharply, torn between disbelief and curiosity. So, if I agree to this, what are the conditions? He walked to the table, his voice steady. No romance. No physical affection. Absolute confidentiality. You will attend 5 events, wear the ring, and pretend we are happy. When it is over, you walk away richer, and I walk away untouched. She studied him, the silence heavy. And what happens if I say no? Adrian met her gaze, his tone polite, almost gentle. Then you can leave. But your company's contract renewal with Hale Construction will likely expire tomorrow. It was not a threat, just a statement of fact. Elena's throat tightened. He was cold, manipulative but not angry. He did not need to raise his voice. His silence was sharp enough. Outside, thunder cracked like a warning. You really think you can buy loyalty that way? She asked. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. No. But I can borrow it. She wanted to hate him for that line, but there was something in his voice that made it sound less like pride and more like confession. When she finally took the pen, her fingers trembled. Fine. 6 months. She signed her name, the ink spreading across the paper like fate sealing itself. Adrian picked up his pen and added his signature beside hers. Welcome to the arrangement, Mrs. Hale. The rain outside softened, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Elena stood, her pulse racing. She thought he was heartless, that his silence was arrogance, but she could not shake the feeling that behind those unreadable eyes, something broken was quietly asking to be understood. The following week, the world that Elena Brooks had known was gone. In its place stood marble floors, echoing halls, and servants who moved like whispers. The Hale estate rose outside Manhattan, a mansion built more for silence than for company. She arrived with one suitcase, the ink on the marriage license barely dry. Adrian Hale greeted her in the foyer with the same calm detachment he had in his office. Your room is upstairs. Dinner is at 7, he said, and without another glance, disappeared down the corridor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lang, showed Elena to a vast bedroom that smelled faintly of cedar and money. There was a closet larger than her old apartment, and a window that overlooked the rain-polished gardens. It was beautiful, but it did not feel like home. That night, when she sat alone at the long dining table, the only sound was the distant clink of silverware as Adrian ate at the other end. Between them stretched a gulf of polished wood and unspoken rules. The food is good, she offered softly. He nodded without looking up. It should be. The chef is the best I could find. She swallowed. Do you always eat in silence? He finally looked up, his eyes calm, steady. Silence is safer. She wanted to ask what he meant, but his gaze drifted back to his plate, ending the conversation. Days passed in a rhythm that felt rehearsed. In public, they played the roles perfectly. At a charity luncheon, he offered her his arm, introduced her as his wife, and smiled for the cameras with flawless precision. But when the flashes stopped, his expression faded to glass. People whispered about the beautiful woman who had melted the city's most unreadable man. They did not see how she barely spoke to him at home. They did not see how every night she ate alone. Still, something inside Elena refused to give up. She began leaving small traces of herself around the man's Iona book on the coffee table, a sketch on the kitchen counter, a vase of wildflowers near the staircase. At first, he ignored them. Then one night, she found her sketch framed in the study. When she asked the staff, no one admitted doing it. Adrian said nothing, but she noticed the faintest shift in his tone when he spoke to her after that. The board meeting is Friday, he said one morning, handing her a schedule. We will need to appear convincing. You mean happy, she replied. He hesitated, then said quietly, yes. Happy. The word seemed foreign on his tongue. At the meeting, Elena watched him transform again into the public Adrian, confident, commanding, untouchable. Yet when one investor made a cruel joke about his bought bride, she saw a flicker in his expression, anger, not embarrassment. Before he could speak, she smiled sweetly and said, it is true, he bought me. But only my time, not my dignity. The room went silent, then filled with uneasy laughter. Adrian's eyes met hers across the table. For the first time, something unguarded passed between them. That night, he found her in the library, staring at the storm outside. You did not have to defend me, he said. She turned. I was not defending you. I was defending myself. He looked down, a small, rare smile touching his lips. Either way, thank you. For a heartbeat, the air between them softened. Then his phone buzzed, breaking the spell. He answered, voice clipped, tone businesslike again. She watched the mask return, wondered what ghosts he kept locked behind it. When he hung up, she said quietly, you really are afraid of feeling, aren't you? His jaw tightened. Afraid of losing control, he corrected. There is a difference. She stepped closer. Is there? He did not answer. Outside, thunder rolled again, the same rhythm that had followed them from the night they signed their names. In that flicker of lightning, Elena realized the truth: his silence was not arrogance. It was armor, built long before she ever stepped into his life. And for reasons she could not yet name, she wanted to be the one who learned how to take it off. Autumn settled over New York like a quiet confession, turning the Hale estate into a painting of gold and gray. Weeks had passed since the board meeting, and though Elena and Adrian now moved through the same spaces, something between them had shifted. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt like a wall, more like a waiting room, filled with words neither dared to speak. Every morning he left early for work, every evening she waited in the library sketching by the fire. Sometimes he would pause at the doorway, watching her pencil move, the sound of graphite soft against paper. He never interrupted, but once, when she looked up suddenly, he was gone. One afternoon, she found a wrapped box on her desk. Inside was a set of expensive art supplies and a note in his handwriting, "For your work, not decoration." It was the first time he had written to her. She smiled without meaning to. At dinner that night, she whispered a thank you. He only nodded, but she caught the smallest flicker of warmth in his eyes. Still, there were rules between them, lines neither crossed. The contract hung over every word they spoke, every glance that lingered too long. Yet the house began to change with them. The staff seemed lighter. Music played softly in the halls again. One evening, while they prepared to attend a foundation gala, she noticed him standing by the mirror, adjusting his tie. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "You hate these events, do you not?" she asked gently. He glanced at her reflection. "They are necessary." She stepped closer, fixing the knot for him. "Necessary does not mean easy." He looked down at her then, truly looked. "I do not like being looked at," he admitted quietly. "It feels like drowning." She met his eyes in the mirror. "Then breathe with me," she said, voice steady. The gala lights were blinding, but Adrian kept his composure. Elena stayed by his side, guiding him through the sea of faces. Every time he faltered, she would touch his hand lightly, a reminder that he was not alone. Reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs burst like miniature explosions. Adrian's shoulders tensed, but when she smiled up at him, he exhaled, his grip on her hand tightening in silent gratitude. Later that night, back at the mansion, she found him outside on the balcony, staring at the city. The moonlight softened his profile, the strong lines now touched with something human. "You did well," she said softly. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. "I survived." She leaned against the railing beside him. "Sometimes surviving is enough." They stood there in silence, the night humming between them. Then, without warning, he said, "The bridge collapsed 3 years ago. It was my project." She turned sharply. "You mean the one that—" "Yes," he said before she could finish. 42 people died, including my fiancé." The confession hung in the air like a wound reopened. "I have built everything since then, trying to prove I am not a monster. But every time I hear a crowd, I see their faces." Elena's chest tightened. She reached out, resting a hand over his. "That was not arrogance," she whispered. "That was grief." He did not move for a long moment. Then he said, almost in disbelief, "You are the first person who did not walk away when I told the truth." "Maybe because I know what it feels like to lose something you cannot fix," she replied. "When my father died, I stopped drawing for 2 years. I thought if I stayed numb, the pain would stop finding me." Adrian turned to face her. "Did it work?" "No," she said softly. "But feeling again did." For a second, neither spoke. The wind lifted her hair, brushed his face. In that fragile stillness, he reached out and tucked a strand behind her ear, a small, uncertain gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. Then he stepped back, as if afraid of what he had just done. "Good night, Elena," he said quietly, and walked inside. She stayed on the balcony long after he was gone, her heart caught somewhere between sadness and hope. For the first time, she realized she was not pretending anymore. This marriage had started as a contract, but something real was slowly writing itself between the lines. Winter arrived early that year, wrapping the Hale estate in quiet frost. Snow gathered along the marble balcony where Elena often stood, sketchbook in hand, the city lights blinking faintly below. Since that night of confessions, something between her and Adrian had changed. They spoke more often now, not as strangers bound by paper, but as two people learning the language of silence together. He would stop by her studio in the afternoons, sometimes offering coffee, sometimes just watching her draw. Once, when she asked why, he said simply, "Your world is quieter than mine. I like it here." It was the closest he had come to admitting peace. One morning, Mrs. Lang entered with a garment bag and an invitation embossed in gold. "The Hale Foundation Gala," she said. "It is next week." Elena smiled politely, but her heart stuttered when she read the details. The event would be held at the Grand Aurora Hotel, the same venue where Adrian had last appeared with his late fiancée. When she showed him the card, his expression did not change, but his hands tightened on the edge of the desk. "We will attend," he said finally. "It is expected." "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "You do not have to prove anything to anyone." His voice was calm but distant. "Maybe it is time I stop hiding." The night of the gala shimmered with chandeliers and polished marble. Cameras flashed the moment they entered. Adrian looked composed in his black suit, Elena radiant in a silver gown that moved like water. They smiled for the press, a picture of poise and perfection. Yet beneath the glitter, she could feel his pulse racing through his palm as she held his hand. During dinner, a familiar face approached the chairman of the board, Mr. Voss, tall, smug, his words dripping with charm. "Adrian, your new wife is quite the upgrade," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. The laughter around them was sharp, cruel. Adrian stiffened, but before he could respond, Elena rose gracefully. "Upgrade?" she said, her voice calm but firm. "No, I think he just finally chose someone real." The room went silent. Mr. Voss blinked, caught off guard, then muttered something and excused himself. Adrian stared at her, speechless, the corners of his mouth softening into something almost like pride. Later that night, after the applause and the endless small talk, he led her to the rooftop terrace to breathe. Snow had begun to fall again, tiny flakes catching in her hair. "You should not have defended me," he said quietly. She smiled. "I did not. I told the truth." He looked away, his breath clouding in the cold. "You make it sound simple." "It is not," she admitted. "But pretending to be heartless forever seems harder." He laughed softly, the sound low and disbelieving. "You think I am heartless?" She shook her head. "No. I think you are terrified of caring." His eyes met hers then, unguarded for the first time. "Because caring means losing," he said. "I already lost once." "Then do not lose again," she whispered. "Not like this." For a long moment, the world shrank to the sound of snow landing softly around them. Then he reached out and took her hand, not as an act, not as a clause of a contract, but as something human, fragile, and true. The moment was real, but reality has sharp edges. The next morning, a storm of headlines hit every business page, Hale's fake marriage exposed. Someone had leaked a copy of the contract, every clause, every rule, every price. The news spread faster than they could contain it. By noon, cameras were outside the gates, reporters shouting accusations. Adrian stood by the window of his office, jaw clenched. "Who did this?" he muttered. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she read the words printed beneath their wedding photo. "She sold her name for a millionaire's redemption." "This is not fair," she said, her voice trembling. "They are twisting everything." He did not turn to her. "Fairness does not matter in my world," he said flatly. "Only control." "So what now?" she asked. "Do we pretend again?" His silence answered for him. She stared at his back, the man who had just started to open up now building walls faster than ever. "I thought you trusted me," she whispered. He turned then, eyes hollow. "Trust is a luxury I cannot afford." The words cut deeper than any headline. She stepped closer, voice breaking. You are not protecting me. You are pushing me away because you are afraid. Maybe I am, he said. But it is safer that way. She shook her head, tears glinting in the light. For you, maybe. Not for me. Without another word, she walked out, the echo of her footsteps the only sound in the room. Adrian stayed frozen by the window, staring at the storm outside, unaware that in trying to save himself, he had just lost the only person who saw him for who he truly was. Elena left the Hale estate that same night, the snow swallowing the sound of her footsteps. The headlines followed her everywhere, in phone screens, in coffee shop whispers, even in the pitying glances of strangers on the subway. Every article reduced her to a transaction, a nameless woman who sold herself for comfort. What they did not print was the truth that she had walked away with nothing but a cracked heart. Days turned into weeks. She rented a small apartment above an art supply store downtown, the kind of place that creaked with every step but gave her peace. She taught sketching classes to children, kept her head down, and avoided the news. Every night she checked her phone, waiting for a message that never came. Adrian's silence was louder now than it had ever been. At Hale Corporation, the damage was worse than he let on. The board demanded answers, shareholders panicked, and journalists camped outside his building like vultures. When his legal team suggested a public statement, he refused. The more we speak, the deeper the wound, he said. But in private, he could not sleep. The mansion felt colder without her. Her sketches were gone from the walls, her laughter no longer echoed through the halls. He caught himself reaching for 2 coffee cups in the morning, then stopping midway, realizing she would not be there. Mrs. Lang watched him quietly, wanting to speak but choosing silence. One evening, she left an envelope on his desk. Inside was a clipping from an art magazine featuring a small downtown gallery. A photograph showed Elena standing beside her drawings, smiling faintly, the caption reading, "Local artistry builds from ruins." Adrian traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. Something inside him cracked open. The next day, he disappeared from the office without a word. At sunset, he found himself standing outside the gallery, dressed plainly, without the armor of his tailored suits. Inside, soft music played, and people milled about, admiring sketches of city bridges, rain-soaked streets, and empty rooms filled with light. Her art had changed, warmer, braver. In one corner hung a drawing he recognized instantly, the Hale mansion, its windows glowing gold instead of gray. Elena stood near it, talking to a young boy clutching a pencil. She laughed, her smile gentle, unguarded. When she turned and saw him, her breath caught. The room fell away. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "You should not be here," she said softly. "The press will follow you." He shook his head. "I do not care about them anymore." "You should," she replied. "They can ruin you." "They already did," he said. "But they cannot ruin what I lost." Her eyes flickered, uncertain. "What do you want, Adrian?" He exhaled slowly, voice trembling despite his composure. "To apologize. Not for the contract, but for not trusting you. For letting fear speak louder than truth." She folded her arms, holding herself together. "Words are easy." "Then let me show you," he said quietly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. It was the original marriage contract torn in half. "I am not asking you to come back to my house," he continued. "I am asking you to come back to my life, without conditions." She looked at him, torn between anger and the pull she still felt. "You think one gesture erases everything?" "No," he said. "But it is a start." Around them, people kept walking, unaware that the air between the two was charged with the weight of everything left unsaid. Finally, Elena whispered, "I do not know if I can trust you again." Adrian stepped closer, his eyes steady. "Then let me earn it, one day at a time." The honesty in his tone broke her defenses. She looked down, blinking back tears. "I do not want promises," she said. "Just truth." Then truth is all I will give, he replied. They stood in silence, the city humming outside. Slowly, she reached out, touching his hand the same way she had at the gala, steady and sure. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth sink in. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was hope. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer. You can start by helping me clean up after the show. He smiled, a real, human smile this time. That, I can do. And for the first time in months, the weight in his chest began to lift. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the city lights glowed brighter, as if even the world had been waiting for this quiet reconciliation. The following weeks passed quietly, but the quiet this time did not ache. Adrian kept his promise. He visited Elena's gallery every morning, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes helping sweep the floors before the doors opened. The tabloids eventually lost interest when there was no scandal left to feed on. The billionaire and the artist simply existed side by side, rebuilding something that neither could name yet. One afternoon, a group of children from a community center came for an art class. Elena guided them through drawing skylines and bridges, laughing as their pencils darted across the paper. Adrian stayed in the back, unnoticed at first, watching how she spoke with patience, how she saw potential in every smudged line. When one of the children asked him to hold a drawing steady, he did, his large hands awkward but gentle. The little girl looked up at him and said, "You draw like someone who is afraid to make mistakes." He froze, then smiled faintly. That might be true. Elena overheard, her eyes softening. Later, as they locked up the gallery, she said quietly, "You are good with them." He shook his head. "I have never been good with anyone." "You are learning," she replied. "That counts." They began to spend more time together outside the gallery, coffee in the park, long walks along the river, small conversations that carried more honesty than their entire marriage had. The distance between them was shrinking, replaced by something gentler, truer. One night, as they closed up after another class, the power suddenly went out. The city lights outside flickered off, leaving only the glow of a single emergency lamp. Adrian reached for his phone, but Elena laughed softly. "Relax," she said. "It is just a blackout." They sat on the floor, backs against the wall, surrounded by unfinished sketches. The silence was comfortable. After a moment, she said, "You used to be afraid of silence." "I still am," he admitted. "But with you, it feels different." She turned her head, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. "What changed?" He hesitated, then said, "You." The word hung between them like a heartbeat. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and steady. He reached out, brushing her hand lightly. She did not pull away. "Elena," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I do not know what comes next. I only know I want to face it with you." She studied him for a long moment. "You are not afraid anymore?" He smiled, small and uncertain. "I am terrified. But I am done letting fear decide." She leaned closer, close enough to feel his breath. "Then stop talking," she said gently. The kiss that followed was quiet and hesitant, the kind that felt like both an ending and a beginning. When the lights flickered back on, they both laughed, the tension melting away. In the days that followed, word spread that the Hale Corporation would sponsor the community art program, turning Elena's small gallery into a foundation for young artists. Reporters asked if this meant they were back together. Adrian answered simply, "We never stopped caring." It was the first public statement he had given in months, and it was the only one that mattered. On the night the new studio opened, he stood beside her as she unveiled a piece titled, "Fearless." It was a charcoal drawing of two figures standing under the same umbrella, half in shadow, half in light. When he looked closer, he realized it was them. She whispered, "You said you hated crowds. So I painted one where you would never feel alone." His throat tightened, emotion catching him off guard. "You built this for me," he said. "No," she replied. "I built it for us." The applause rose around them, but all he could see was her smile. In that moment, the mansion, the headlines, the broken past, they all faded. What remained was simple and solid. She had mistaken his silence for arrogance once, and he had called it fear. Now they both knew the truth. It had always been love, just waiting for the courage to speak. For a while, it felt as if peace had finally found them. The foundation grew quickly, attracting young artists from every corner of the city. Adrian balanced his corporate world with his quiet visits to the studio, where he often stayed late just to watch Elena work. They were not married on paper anymore, but something deeper had taken root, something that did not need signatures. Yet happiness, as Adrian knew too well, was fragile. One morning, while reviewing new contracts for the foundation, he noticed irregular financial transfers. Funds were missing, large sums routed through shell accounts under the Hale Corporation name. The numbers were buried well, but not well enough. Adrian's stomach sank. Someone inside was sabotaging him. That evening, he called a board meeting. When he presented the findings, silence filled the room. Finally, Mr. Voss, the same man who had mocked Elena at the gala, leaned back and said smoothly, "Accusations like that require proof, Adrian. Be careful. You already have a reputation for emotional decisions." The room tensed. Adrian recognized the trap instantly. If the media caught wind of this, the foundation could collapse before it had even begun. After the meeting, he returned to the mansion he had avoided for months. It felt haunted, filled with echoes of what he had lost and found again. He poured himself a drink and stared out at the snow. Fear whispered again, the same voice that once made him push everyone away. The next morning, he went to see Elena. She was in the studio, helping a student adjust a canvas. "You look troubled," she said. He hesitated, then handed her the reports. "Someone is trying to destroy everything we built." She scanned the documents, her face hardening. "Who would do this?" "Voss," he said. "But I cannot prove it yet." "Then let me help," she said. "I have connections in the art world, people who handle grants and donations. Maybe we can trace it from there." He shook his head. "No. You have done enough. I will not drag you into this again." She looked at him steadily. "You asked me once to stand beside you, not behind you. Let me keep that promise." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded, the weight in his chest easing slightly. Together, they spent nights combing through files and financial trails. The pattern slowly emerged: donations rerouted through fake charities, all leading back to a single account under Voss's assistant. When Adrian confronted him at the next meeting, the evidence was irrefutable. The board fell silent as Voss's confident mask cracked. "You wanted my failure," Adrian said calmly. "But what you built on lies cannot outlast truth." Voss was removed from the board within hours. The headlines that once mocked Adrian now called him the silent CEO who fought back. When he showed the article to Elena, she smiled softly. "You did it." "We did," he corrected. She touched his arm. "So what happens now?" Adrian looked around the studio, the place that had become their second home. "Now," he said, "we stop surviving and start living." She laughed, light and free, and for the first time, he laughed too unrestrained, unguarded. The fear that had ruled his life for years had finally loosened its grip. Outside, the snow was melting, and through the windows, sunlight spilled across the floor like a promise of everything still waiting ahead. Weeks later, the world seemed to have finally turned in their favor. The scandal was forgotten, the foundation thrived, and for the first time in years, Adrian allowed himself to believe that peace could last. He and Elena spent their mornings walking through the city and their nights planning art programs for underprivileged schools. It was not about money anymore. It was about meaning. But just when everything felt whole, fate decided to test them one last time. A major investor suddenly withdrew his support from the foundation, claiming ethical concerns. Soon after, another followed. Within days, donations froze. Elena's phone buzzed with endless calls from journalists asking whether the foundation was laundering money through art sales. At first, she dismissed it as rumor. Then one night, Adrian returned home with a newspaper in his hand. Across the front page was a headline that made her heart stop. Hale Foundation under investigation. Beneath it was a photo of her standing beside one of her students, the caption twisting the truth: CEO's lover profits from fake charity. She looked up at him, her voice breaking. "You think I had something to do with this?" Adrian's expression was unreadable, but the hesitation in his silence said enough. She stepped back. "After everything we have been through, you still do not trust me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, the weight of his old fear crushing his words. "I just need to know," he said quietly. "Did you sell any of the pieces without declaring them?" Her face hardened, tears stinging her eyes. "No. But it is clear you have already decided." She turned away before he could stop her. "You once said you were done letting fear decide. I guess fear still speaks louder than love." She left before dawn, the gallery lights still glowing behind her. For days, Adrian buried himself in work, chasing numbers, chasing ghosts. But the silence that had once been his refuge now felt unbearable. He could not sleep, could not think. Every room in his house echoed with her absence. Then, late one night, Mrs. Lang entered his study, holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said softly. Inside was a handwritten letter from one of Elena's students. It read, "Mr. Hale, thank you for giving us a place to dream. Miss Brooks said you built this for all of us." Tucked inside the letter was a receipt, an official transaction proving every cent of the gallery's funds had been accounted for. The investigation was based on forged documents. Someone had framed them, again. Adrian stood there, numb, realization cutting through him like ice. He had doubted the one person who had stood by him through every storm. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and drove through the city night until he reached the small apartment above the art store. When she opened the door, he looked nothing like the man who once hid behind silence. "You were right," he said, breathless. "It was all false. The reports, the rumors, they were planted by Voss's people. You are innocent." She folded her arms, eyes shining but guarded. "You should have believed that before you found proof." He nodded, guilt heavy in his chest. "I should have. I was afraid, again afraid of losing control, of losing you. And I ended up losing both." She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "So why are you here now?" He took a shaky breath. "Because I would rather risk being hurt than live another day in silence." The sincerity in his voice broke through her defenses. For a moment, the space between them disappeared. She whispered, "If you want forgiveness, it has to be earned." "Then I will spend the rest of my life earning it," he said. The words hung in the air like a vow. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the city, washing away the last shadows of fear. Spring came early that year, washing New York in sunlight and new beginnings. The investigation against the Hale Foundation was officially closed, clearing both Adrian and Elena of every accusation. Newspapers printed quiet retractions, but neither of them cared. The damage to their names had healed faster than the cracks between their hearts. For months, Adrian showed up at the gallery every day, keeping his word. He helped organize classes, delivered supplies to schools, and quietly rebuilt the trust he had broken. Elena never promised forgiveness, but she let him stay. Little by little, laughter returned, and the silence that once haunted them turned gentle again. One evening, the foundation hosted its annual showcase, a night dedicated to the students' art. The hall was filled with color, light, and the chatter of young voices. As the event ended, Elena stepped onto the stage to thank the crowd. 3 years ago, she said, this began as a dream built from broken pieces. Today, it stands because people chose courage over fear. She looked toward Adrian, standing near the back, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable but proud. When the applause faded, he walked toward her, carrying a small velvet box. The room went still. Elena Brooks, he said, his voice steady. We started with a contract, a lie, and 1,000 misunderstandings. But somewhere in that chaos, I found the truth. I found you. Her breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring. This time, he continued, no signatures, no rules, no fear. Just love. Will you marry me, for real? The crowd erupted in soft gasps, phones lifted, flashes of light sparking around them. But all Elena saw was him, the man who had once been too afraid to speak, now standing unguarded before the world. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, yes. The room broke into applause, but Adrian only heard her voice. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and the weight of the past finally lifted. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the spring rain, just like the night they first met. Later, as they stood under the same umbrella, Elena smiled up at him. You know, she said, I never really mistook your silence for arrogance. I just did not know what it meant. He smiled faintly. And what does it mean now? It means peace, she whispered. He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. Then let us never lose it again. Around them, the rain fell softly, washing away every shadow that had ever lingered between them. The story that began as a contract ended as a promise, a quiet truth that love is not born from perfection, but from patience, forgiveness, and the courage to try again. She had once mistaken his silence for arrogance, and he had called it fear. But in the end, they both learned that sometimes silence is not distance, it is the sound of two hearts finally beating in the same rhythm.